Welcome to Block by Block, where we dive into timely topics at the intersection of crypto, tech, and society. I'm your host, Denelle Dixon, CEO and Executive Director of the Stellar Development Foundation. My guest today is Janet Foutty, Executive Chair of the Board for Deloitte US, advocate for women's leadership in tech and Web3, author, mom, and so much more. She joined me to discuss navigating the path to finding your passion, disruption, and creating the backbone companies need to adapt to digital transformation, the breadth of the Web3 opportunity, and the clients she sees coming to Deloitte looking to engage. And finally, the importance of leading authentically. Janet, it's so great to sit down with you for this installment of Block by Block. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Denelle. It is wonderful to be here with you.
So we were together most recently in Davos for the World Economic Forum, the annual meeting there. And it was so awesome to spend time with you there and speak together about all things women leadership and Web3, which we'll dig into a bit today. But first, I thought it would be really awesome if you could introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, thank you. And yes, it was very fun to be in Davos together. A little, I always find it a little surreal there, but Denelle created a packed house. So we had what I thought was walking in to be a relatively modest end of the day panel, and it was standing room only. So hats off to you and your team for creating a fabulous event. So just a little quick background about me. My name is Janet Foutty. My current role is I'm the executive chair of the Deloitte board in the United States and also a member of Deloitte's global board. Formerly, I was the chair and CEO of Deloitte Consulting. To maybe tie it into this conversation, I started my career in back office technology on Wall Street, and certainly one of the few women at that time, but really cemented both my passion around technology, but also inclusion. And that really sits sort of at the heart of my leadership journey. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation today about many dimensions of my backstory and where we find ourselves today.
That's so awesome. Your background is so fascinating to me. And I love to hear people's sort of journeys. I always think about, we come together and we all have our own story. And I would just love to have an understanding of what motivated you or shaped your experiences for you, early experiences that shaped and motivated you professionally.
Well, maybe I'll go back to my earliest influence, which is they certainly say that business is equal parts art and science. And so am I. My mom is an artist and my father was a scientist. And through their really different lenses, they encouraged me to do the things you'd expect around a dinner table of an artist and a scientist: ask thoughtful questions, give honest feedback, pay attention to the world around me. They did not start out as artists and scientists, however, which is really big part of my story. They were both the first generation in their families to go to college, and they got really pushed into their fields of study. And it wasn't until they had both finished their PhDs that they realized that their field of study was not a field of study that interested them.
That is so funny.
So
it's such a common experience, by the way, but hilarious.
Right? So they both encouraged my sister and I to be fearless about doing things that gave us energy, changing our mind. There's all this discussion about follow your passion or don't follow your passion. I didn't know what my passion was. So I really became a believer that it's okay to let your passion find you, as they did. Maybe I wasn't on quite as circuitous a route, and really to try to find meaning what I was doing versus trying to chase it down. And then my career has definitely been, though all within the same firm and all within professional services, has absolutely been about reinventing myself, which I certainly learned starting at the dinner table many, many, many years ago at this point.
That is so great. I think our family life and how our parents viewed not just like their expectations of us have so much to do with our expectations of what's around us. So that's great to know that your parents, first of all, having the art side and the science side, so fun, and to have that kind of introspective look at the world is really cool too. So,
well, I will tell you though that I started my career in business right out of undergrad, and I literally thought going into college that business was selling vacuum cleaners door to door. Like that was, which with all total respect for those courageous enough to sell door to door, but that was in my little narrow view of the world. Growing up outside of Washington, D.C., that's what I thought business was. And so there were many things I learned around the table, but I had a lot to learn as I started my career.
I love it. The vacuum cleaner door to door.
Yes, that it was imprinted in my brain.
Like, so your current
do people even really sell vacuum cleaners door to door? I think they do, but
I don't know if
apparently in
they
the
still
day.
do, but they certainly did when I was a kid. So your current role is executive board chair, as you mentioned, but before that, you were CEO of Deloitte Consulting, where you led a significant investment and transformation on the digital side of the business. So very different from selling vacuum cleaners door to door. But can you talk to us about what that looked like?
Yeah, so this sort of part of my journey really started when I was leading our technology practice, and the introduction of digital technologies into the enterprise was really in its very earliest day. I actually started my career as a back office quant on Wall Street. And so this idea of digital technologies, especially in and around customers and consumers and constituents, if you think about government, was very foreign to me. So I was able to listen to really smart people on my team around me that really started pushing my thinking on sort of the digitization of all of our interfaces in business. And that is what launched the Deloitte digital business, which is, I think, quite well known today, and led to, as I flipped forward into being the CEO of Deloitte Consulting, was sort of fundamental to how I thought about leading change. So in the years I spent in that role, at its heart, it was about leading change. And that was to our operating model, talent models, go-to-market strategies, and frankly, getting people comfortable with transformation. So maybe just a quick story. In my first year in the job, there was a part of the business that was underperforming. And I cannot say that I had this sort of broad perspective on the transformation we were going to go through, but it really helped inform the rest of my time. So this segment of the business was doing just fine, but rather than investing in new technologies and how digital transformation was going to change that business, it was really relying on what they'd done before. And I really believe
So common.
I really believe that reinvention is a muscle, and ours was frankly atrophying in this part of the business. And so when disruption hit, as it does, we were less prepared than we wanted to be. So spent a lot of time in sort of working on the hearts and minds in that business to what the future could look like, and frankly, the change management journey in and around the digital transformation of that business. So I then had the opportunity to sort of take those learnings and help drive them through the whole practice, leading to very significant operating model and go-to-market changes that I referred to. When I really reflect on that time in the business, and it is what I think about in and around the transformation and changes we've continued to go through, I really made it my mission to make the organization sort of exponentially more comfortable with change. And that's, I think, what has sat at the heart of the matter in terms of my leadership. Obviously, everyone in an agile workplace, everyone has a very different permission to raise challenges and focus on solutions. And, I in some ways better to be lucky than good, because obviously the last 2.5 years have certainly reinforced that disruption and agility are at the heart of the matter. So that's a little bit about the journey that we went on. I'm really proud of where the team is today, where technology is basically sort of sitting embedded in every dimension of our business. And though, like every organization, we have to continue to work on that agility and getting comfortable with change, a long way on that journey.
Well, and it's as much about the human side as it is about the actual change that you're making from the digitization side.
That's really the heart of my experience. It is just that, because the technologies are going to continue to change and evolve, and how you apply them, it's going to continue to change and evolve. So that's it. The heart of the matter. I do believe that digital transformation is a people-centric topic, and the change management around it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that in working with lots of these institutions who have been around for a long time, certainly focusing on what we focus on, Web3, blockchain, payments, doing payments differently. It's very hard to move. And it's because there's so much comfort with the existing technology from a human side.
Exactly.
So it's really hard to get that. But how are you seeing the market leverage the opportunities that Web3 has to offer? Are you seeing much of that happen in your space?
So we are, but I want to start by saying the ecosystem, and maybe an overused term, ecosystem, but the conversation is really broad. So maybe I'll take a step back. So we've been in the blockchain and digital asset space which I really think of more as sort of backbone and infrastructure, which allows Web3 to be commercial versus just an interface, which you know even better than I do. We've been in that space for about a decade, and it continues to be an area of growth for us. Just by sort of the type of clients we serve within a week, the ecosystem tells you about the opportunities Web3 has to offer. So we work with traditional enterprises and government, as I said earlier, and blockchain and digital asset specific companies. So we're very focused on financial services, as you can imagine, including banking and capital markets and payments, gaming companies, metaverse plays, NFTs, crypto native, brand named funds investing in crypto, infrastructure companies, protocol and token issuers. So it is a really broad list. I thought it might be good to talk about sort of the good, the promising, and I won't say the ugly, maybe the challenges, if I could. So the good is absolutely that the implementations are advancing, moving from proof of concept to deployment serving customers and clients. So that is, and we all, I think, well understand the technology curve absolutely moving out of ideation and proof of concept. The promising, I think, is the early advancement of the metaverse, but I really feel we have to temper that because there's so much hype and so much critique. And then on the challenges front, with so many elements of Web3 unfolding and creating opportunities, the risks and uncertainties are just inherent in any disruptive shift. And I think we're already starting to have the right and really meaningful conversation. And maybe I'll just sort of close this part of the conversation through my lens as a board chair. As you know, I'm a technologist at heart, even though we've talked about a lot of change in people. My role today is through the lens of governance, which is all about asking really thoughtful questions and making sure the risks and opportunities are being fully addressed. So what changes are going to come as regulation advances in the conversation? What's the role of AI in amplifying these capabilities, which I think is a really interesting and important part of the conversation. Cyber goes without saying, but as my kids say, you should never say goes without saying and say it, but I said it anyway. And then, of course, maybe the most important, the ethical implications, the energy demands, which I know you and I had some really good conversation about. How is inclusion baked into the design and the adoption and the use cases? So those are some of the things from a governance lens that I'm really pushing, our board and our management teams thinking around, and we're spending a lot of time out and about with our clients. So lots of really interesting things across a broad set of industries, lots of challenges to look at, but some big, meaty, complex questions to address as well.
Yeah, and I love that you're thinking about it. The governance side of it and where you sit now is, I think, one of the most important areas, because you have to push. But you also have to say the risk reward thing is a really important way to think through how much to push.
Right.
So I do see a lot more traditional players that are interested and want to get into the space. I do think the regulatory environment, and when we settle the regulatory environment a bit more, it's going to open up those doors a lot more. So probably a lot of the folks that you work with will be more open to it once we have clarity domestically as well as internationally.
But I do think, if I go back to my very first point, the backbone and infrastructure that allows us to move into commercial is continuing to advance really aggressively while the regulatory and social environment catches up.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's the way it should be. I mean, just think about the early days of the web. If we hadn't have had the push into this technology, we wouldn't be where we are today, being able to do all of this in different locations. And yes, so this is awesome. So this is one of the things I love about your work. You're a fierce advocate for women's leadership, and this is what your new book, Arrive and Thrive, is all about. The writing process must have been really interesting and brought back a lot of memories, thinking through your career and what you've learned. Can you recall a moment in your career where you really felt the impact of having the support of other women at work, whether that was a sponsor, someone who helped you, someone who either worked in the office with you or elsewhere, that you reflect on?
Yeah, so I have been incredibly fortunate both in my experience in being sponsored, but I also love to talk about how that's evolved in terms of my own leadership. So the very, very beginning of my career, we were assigned coaches, so to speak, because in professional services, you move from project to project. So you don't have a traditional boss. So we're assigned a coach. And my first coach was an incredible woman named Catherine. She was absolutely groundbreaking. She was a technologist back in the early 90s when there were very few women partners who were technologists. And she was absolutely fearless in terms of pushing the organization and pushing me. She was an incredible sponsor from, frankly, the moment I stepped into the organization to, I call her today when I've got a complex thing that I'm grappling with, either personally and professionally, and she continues. Though probably less of a sponsor today, given her role has evolved, but absolutely still a coach and a friend, and someone I know I can rely on. So I was incredibly fortunate, and there was some great serendipity that I got, frankly, assigned to her. But
yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that was purposeful because you were a woman and she was?
I don't. I think it was serendipitous. And I think I was incredibly lucky. But what I think is meaningful is that she chose to really invest in me. And I learned so much from her. For me, there was really a moment when I started realizing that I was always someone who was really interested in people and people development, but the point where I really paid it forward was about probably 8 or 9 years, maybe not even quite, 6 or 7 years into my career. I sold a small project to a client that was a client that was in town, and I live in Chicago. That's where I'm actually talking to you from today. But some other important things were happening in my world. I was a new mom of newborn twins and adjusting to everything that came with that. And I had no idea whether I was going to be able to stay in this job, whether I was going to be working part-time, full-time, change careers. I had no idea what the next chapters of my life were going to be like. But I'd sold this small project that was in town, which meant I didn't need to be on an airplane. And I had these newborn twins to navigate with my husband. And so it was such a pivotal moment in terms of how I thought about leadership and sponsoring, actually creating a great environment, but sponsoring women in particular, because this project was really complicated and went well beyond the things that I knew how to do. So I had to build a really diverse team. And any sense of sort of walls or barriers I put up around me, we talk about authenticity so much today. When I started my career, authenticity was not in the conversation. So any sort of boundaries or barriers within still being in a professional environment and trying to juggle this life of this really complex project that I wanted to be wildly successful and newborn twins, a lot of those barriers sort of floated away. And I was able to be much more myself in my work environment, frankly, because I didn't really have I didn't have the time or energy to do anything but be myself. But what I found was in being more myself in terms of the things I was juggling, the things I was working through, it strengthened my team tremendously. And because what I learned, which we now know, is being an authentic leader creates space for others to be authentic themselves and delivers better results. People are more comfortable, they're more confident, all that good stuff. To tie it back to women, I think women in our practice saw what I was doing as a young mom and this interesting work, and they flocked into my team. And I really sort of opened up my life to them somewhat, in some cases, selfishly. If we were going to do a social event, I was going to host it at my house because I wanted to be with my kids. I didn't realize that the knock-on benefit of that was that the women and men that were working with me saw what was happening up close and personal. We went to two nights working really late and 2 nights leaving early, long before we talked about sort of flexibility. And that was because if I was going to miss the 8 o'clock bedtime, it really didn't matter what time I got home.
Right.
But if I could make it home by 5:30, that was going to allow me to have a really full evening with my kids. So the long and short of that is I think, really demonstrated to me both what I learned way back from my sponsor earlier in my career, but that I could demonstrate through my own leadership and authenticity, doing that myself. We have 13 women partners from that very one project now in the firm. Many of them are actually almost all of them, if not all of them, are moms, and none of them were parents at the time. Many of them are directly women that I've had the privilege to sponsor. So that's a little bit about sort of my journey, and a very pivotal moment for me where I realized how important it was to create a very different kind of working environment.
Yeah, I think that is just such a wonderful story. And so much of what you just said rings true for me. When I reflect back on my early days, I was a trial lawyer, and I was I happened to be at a firm which we actually had 51% women, which was very, very, very rare at the time. But most of those women were part-time, and that's because they had kids, and that's how they made it work. And I didn't have the ability to go part-time, nor was I sure that I wanted to, but just being able to have those women in the firm that had already sort of paved that path for us to be able to know that children, and I had children at the time, and I wanted to be able to talk about them, and I wanted to be able to make sure I got to the events for them, but I also wanted to, kick ass at work. And so balancing all of those things was really hard, but having that comfort of knowing that there were others that also had made decisions around their life balance, and they made it work for them, was really important. So I'm so happy that you talk about this, and I've heard you talk about overcoming and all these different hurdles that women have to overcome at the office. And this doesn't say that men don't have similar hurdles to overcome.
For sure.
We definitely, when we have children, it creates this historically, and I hope not as much today, but it creates this thought amongst us that we need to be home more, and that we need to be with them more. And so it's really finding our place, right? And making it, and being authentic and being comfortable with what you're doing, which makes you happier in your work environment and happier with the folks that you're with. And
I guess there's just no doubt that my kids always knew who their mom was. They still do, even though they're in their 20s, and that I was always there when it really mattered. So that was super important to me, and personally, but I also felt incredibly privileged to be able to share that experience set with other young women and men in terms of how to navigate their life. Yeah, and I think I see it more today than ever before, where we do see so many men who are picking up that responsibility and engaging there. And I think that, even at SDF, we have a very balanced leave program for both men and women. And I think that these are all things that we're recognizing more in society, the importance of having that sort of balance. So awesome to see. You spent so much time in male-dominated industries. I mean, I know that you've been at one organization, but the industry itself is very male-dominated. And as executive chair of the board for Deloitte, you play such an important role in how the company, their policies and strategies come together. How does your past experience shape the way that you wield that influence that you have now in guiding the board's oversight of the organization? I would say a couple of things. One is leading authentically, which we've really talked nicely about today. But the other sort of thread of things I think is important to talk about is, when I think about skills that I developed that brought me to this moment, is the skill of courage. And there is no doubt that when we talk about authenticity, courage sits at its center. But when I think about the sets of decisions that business executives have to make today, and the sets of inputs that they have to take into their decision making, it requires a level of, frankly, confidence and courage that I think is different than any of us ever expected. If I tied that back, sort of the journey that I've been on, my technology heritage absolutely taught me the value of continuous learning and how to stay curious and stay ahead of the conversation. And that has absolutely sort of threaded through with me. We talked earlier about getting comfortable with change, but some of getting comfortable with change is, how do you continue to change the voices that are around you? The sets of issues that I feel that I have to be smart on today, I think are very different than what someone in my role not that many years ago had to be smart about. If you think about everything from technology disruption to social justice to diversity, equity, and inclusion, those are things that were not sitting in the boardroom agenda. So for me, probably learning and being open to hearing different voices and learning from different voices is probably the biggest thing that I have sort of both pushed myself as well as my team on the most aggressively.
Yeah, that is awesome. And I think that especially there needs to be bottoms up and tops down, but having that sort of comfort at the top to be able to push and think about things in the way you just articulated allows sort of the bottoms up approach to have that view too. So awesome. Deloitte recently released a DE&I transparency report, and that included data on your organization and commitments that you're making for the future. So tell us what you learned from that and how you're focusing your goal setting process around that.
Yeah, so this was a very big moment for us. We actually just released our second transparency report. And I will tell you, the gulp that we took before we released the first one, it was a really big moment for us because it took a combination of confidence, but humility. Yeah. So we've been a leader in and around DEI for a long time, but to expose exactly in fairly intense detail where we are in the journey and what our goals are was a very different moment for us. So maybe two things that we've really learned on this journey. And the first is disaggregation of data. And probably doesn't surprise you since I said earlier I was a quant, but it's really easy to bury the headlines in and around DEI until you really, really break down the data into a very fine level of detail. Things like, what are the breakdown of every dimension that you're measuring by of positions of influence versus strict headcount data? There's a super simple example, which just seems so obvious when you say it, and so much reporting doesn't look at that. So disaggregating the data is one, and that's hard to gulp and do, but once you do it, it's incredibly powerful. The one that's much, much harder to wrap your head around, and frankly for our organization, is how do you break cultural orthodoxies? And frankly, cultural orthodoxies wasn't even in my language or vernacular not that many years ago. So for us, we've really talked about how do we flip those orthodoxies that we've lived with in my 30 years in the organization. Maybe the simplest example is something that I've said many times, which is we have an unbiased meritocracy in our organization. And what I've learned on my own learning journey here is that meritocracies often don't consider that not everyone shows up with the same advantages into the conversation or into the organization. So we've challenged everything from how we recruit people into the organization to how we staff to how we do learning and development to try to take some of the natural bias that was in our system, even though we thought of ourselves very much as a meritocracy. So disaggregation of data, and if you really want to move the equity conversation, really looking at the orthodoxies that exist in your organization and being fearless enough to turn them on their head.
Yeah, those are two really awesome ways to think about it. When you say orthodoxies, you mean sort of the things that you've lived with for time and time
forever,
again.
forever. Yeah. I mean, from the very second I joined the organization, the line was, if you show up here, you're given equal opportunity. We're a meritocracy. That was a core tenet at Deloitte. You make it through the recruiting process and it is a level playing field, and we now understand it's not. So exactly how I did. That was just a simple example of an orthodoxy for us.
Well, one of the things that I found in your book is that you have this concept of investing in your best self. I think that that's awesome. I sometimes think that, frankly, everyone who is working so hard, they forget that part about investing in your best self. And I think women, frankly, have a tendency to sort of not invest in our best self sometimes because we're so busy investing in so many other things and people around us. So tell me about that.
So I will say that I have two co-authors that wrote our book with me, and my co-author, Susan, who's an executive coach and a leadership coach, really pushed my thinking on this topic because I probably lived more in the category of people who would say that, time spent reflecting is time wasted. And she really challenged me on that orthodoxy, if we talk about orthodoxy still. What I was good at, and I'd love to actually hear your take on this for you as well, is I was very good about creating the time and space for things that gave me energy.
Yeah.
And for me, though, they've taken really different shapes over the years. Family and fitness are those two things that I'm very, very that I make sure that I always create the time and space for, because they give me energy, and then in turn, I can be my best self. I know you have a large family. I'd love to hear actually about how that compares and contrasts to your point of view.
Yeah, no, for me, the experience that I've had is that one of the things, there's two things that I'm really good at: creating that space for exercise, because that allows my brain to operate. So I run a lot. I work out in the gym a lot. I really focus on creating that mental energy to be able to do that. And the other thing that I'm really good at, which is not necessarily a positive, is that I'm really good at being critical of myself. But I love the focus that you have on really introspection in a way to improve and to create your best self. And so I've spent a lot of time really trying to use that energy that I can do to be critical and to think I could have always done it 10 times better if I had just done it this or that, to sort of shape into, yes, and I can learn for the next time to do it differently.
Yeah, I think that I, like most people, I think, who have any humility, and certainly many women that I know, obsess over the things that, lie in bed thinking, if I just said this one sentence instead of that, or if I had made this decision. I have over many years figured out how to compartmentalize that. Now, it never goes away for me, but then use that to learn from. And the process of this book really pushed my thinking on how do you make sure that you continue to learn from the things that didn't go the way that you wanted them to. I don't even want to say mistakes, but didn't go the way you wanted them to. And what can you learn from them? And then I guess I would just make sure to acknowledge that, I talked about family and fitness, and the learning I've also had is making space. And I love the way you talk about exercise to this end, is making the space for what matters does not shrink your capacity for work. It actually expands it. You show up stronger, your ability to lead, your ability to think, process, be empathetic for others, which is so important in this moment, is so much stronger when you've created a space for the things that matter to you.
Absolutely. And I think that also gives me, like, the workout routine gives me the ability to do the job that I want to do, but also to have that space to spend time with my family, which is, of course, like one of the most important things that we all want to be able to do in life. So awesome to talk to you. I'm so sad that we have to wrap up, but I'd love to just ask you one last question. Where can people go to keep up with you and all of your work?
Oh, thank you so much. So I'm active on LinkedIn, both in sharing other people's perspectives and writing my own. That's probably the best place. And it's definitely a mix of stuff that's happening in Deloitte, my own personal random experiences and musings, and love to both to share ideas on that platform.
Thank you so much, Janet, for joining us. It was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Denelle, for creating the space for the conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to Block by Block. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when new episodes are released, and follow me on Twitter to stay in the loop in between episodes. I'll talk to you next time.